Hello, I want to introduce Dr. Amy Griffin from the University of Delaware, who I met sometime last year at the home of a mutual friend. I have been a mindfulness meditator for 10 to 15 years regularly, and I know it's helped me a lot in my life in ways that aren't quick and obvious, but they're subtle and clear in helping me decrease my emotional reactivity, for sure, and helping me make friends with my own mind, and helping me appreciate life in every moment way more. And I met Amy and I was very impressed that she's interested in the science of why mindfulness meditation is helpful. And I thought, wow, we got to bring her to Arden. And thankfully, she agreed to come. And may I introduce Dr. Amy Griffin, who's done research in lots of things, but I know that her heart interest, maybe I'm wrong, but I think from what she told me is the neuroscience of mindfulness. Thank you so much for coming.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me all right? Okay, let me start this slideshow. There we go. All right, so I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about my story of how I arrived with mindfulness as being a part of my life. So I was always a real striver, like a real high achieving, reach for the stars. I was the salutatorian of my high school class. I did it all. I went to grad school. I did well there. I got a postdoc. I did well there. I got a faculty job. And so I've always been really, really focused on the next step of my life. And really thinking about, well, if only I can get to this next step, then I'll be happy. And so there was a time when I was just so stressed out about the next step that I was starting to have physical symptoms. So I was starting to get heart palpitations and my face was breaking out. And it was because I was worried about getting a faculty position, which I ended up getting, but I was really worried about it. And so a friend of mine said, "Hey, why don't you come to this yoga class with me?" And so we went to this yoga class, and this is one of those really intense yoga classes, like the room is heated, the instructions are yelling at you, the cues, you know what I mean. You probably know the kind of style of yoga I'm talking about. And I couldn't think about anything else except exactly what I was doing in that moment. So, and it was such a relief to just be in my body and in the moment and not be thinking about, oh, I wonder what's going to happen. What if I don't get a job? Oh, I shouldn't have said that one thing. Or what if that happened? And so instead of doing all that ruminating and all of that worrying, I was just in the moment. And I needed to be in that intense yoga class where I had no option but to be in that moment in order to get me out of that state of worry and regret and rumination. And it was such a relief. And so, of course, I got hooked on the yoga. I started going every day, got really into it, started my faculty job. And then, I thought, well, life is great. I've got it made, and then my tenure evaluation year came, and that is a super stressful year. And so I needed a little boost. So I had my yoga practice. I thought, well, to deepen my practice, maybe I will get trained to be a yoga teacher, and just to deepen my practice. I wasn't necessarily thinking that I would become a yoga teacher. but just to learn more about yoga. And in that yoga teacher training, I was taught the meditation practice that I'm actually going to teach you tonight. And I just found it so helpful, not just the practice itself, not just getting me out of that kind of rumination and the worry, but also the sense of compassion for myself that I was able to develop, the sense of ease and peace and non-judgment. Because being a striver, I was really good at judging myself. And so learning to let go of some of that judging and learning to let go of some of the labeling of the thoughts. This is a good thought. This is a bad thought. This is a good idea. This is a bad idea. So I started doing meditation on my own, and it was very helpful. And I thought, I have to share this with some students, these students that I'm teaching. I really want to share this with the students. And so I got trained. I heard about this program that's run at Duke called the Mindfulness Institute for Emerging Adults. And of course, it was a perfect program for me to learn because it's geared exactly for the age group that I teach, 18 to 25-year-old students. And so I was able to get trained in this mindfulness program. It's a 4-week course. I'll talk a little bit more about it in my talk. But I was able to develop a course. And I thought, well, rather than just teaching them mindfulness practice, I know a little bit about neuroscience. So why don't I integrate neuroscience into that course? And so this is a course I've been teaching for about 10 years now, called Mindfulness in the Brain. And so I teach this course. It's a popular course. The students really get a lot out of it, and I really get a lot out of it. I feel like we learn from each other. And so that's what brought me to mindfulness. That was kind of a little bit of my story and why I'm talking about mindfulness today. But my research is actually ironically on our ability to mentally time travel, our ability to relive the past and imagine a possible future. It's a remarkable ability, but sometimes it can come at an emotional cost, as we'll see in this talk. So I thought what we could do is do a little practice together. And so this is a practice called shamatha. It is a focused attention practice that is just a breath awareness. So there's nothing fancy or complex about it. And if you don't want to do it, I won't be offended. But we're just going to start by taking a seat. You guys are all sitting, but sit comfortably, but maybe with your back away from the chair and your feet flat on the floor. And you can just place your hands on your lap and just rest your shoulders. So you don't have to feel like you're doing anything special or feel uptight or anything, just kind of sitting comfortably tall. And take your gaze. You don't have to close your eyes. In fact, this practice is usually practiced with eyes open, but the gaze is ahead of you and just kind of focus downward so that you're not looking at any one thing and you're not looking around the room. You're just letting your eyes kind of focus down. And so that's the first part of this, is just starting to feel rooted, like you're sitting in this place, feeling that you are taking your seat. And then the next step is that I'll ask you to bring your attention to your breath. And so for some of us, that might mean bringing awareness to the sensation of the breath moving your belly up and down. It might mean feeling the breath at the nostrils. So wherever you can most easily feel your breath in your body, just kind of pay attention to that, where that feeling is. And then once you start to bring your attention to your breath, you'll notice fairly quickly that thoughts will start to enter in. And the real difficult part of this practice is just without judgment, allow those thoughts to come in, acknowledge them as thinking, and then return the attention back to the breath. So it's really not about clearing the mind. It's about noticing when thoughts come up and returning your attention back to the breath. So that's it. You take your seat, you take your attention to your breath, and when thoughts arise, you just say thinking, bring your attention back. And so I'm going to be quiet for a minute here, a minute or two, and I'm going to let you practice. And at the end, I'll ring a bell so you know that it's over. So let's just do a few minutes of practice. Okay. Does anybody want to tell me, what did you notice? Is there anything that you noticed when you were in that practice? Any thoughts? Calm? More calm. Okay. Anything else? What else did you notice during that practice? Okay. Okay. Great. Great. Other too many thoughts. So your judgment was coming in.
I noticed I was being more in tune with my body and like my heart rate and stuff.
Okay.
Also noticed what
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. Anything else?
Of having this student, I waited last on really ate it. It was because I could feel it coming my breath.
Oh,
Back in me, so it was really very physical. I struggle.
okay. You surprised yourself.
Well, it was a fact, yeah. It's just you can feel it.
Yeah.
It's warmer. I've never really done that with a mask.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good. Well, thank you for sharing your reactions to that. I wanted to give you a little bit of experiential learning as to what a focused attention practice is. And this is what I do with my students. They come in the first day of class and I say, okay, we're going to meditate. And they're like, what? What? I thought we were learning about the brain. I was like, well, we are, but you're going to learn about your brain first. So here's a little overview of what I'm going to talk about tonight. So we're going to start by talking about an experiment that investigated the relationship between mind wandering and happiness. And you can probably guess what the relationship was, but I won't spoil it. And then we will have a formal definition of mindfulness. What is it? What is it exactly? Hear a lot about it. What is it? And then I'm going to talk about some studies that have looked at mindfulness and well-being, and then mindfulness as an intervention in clinical populations. And then end with some talk of the structural and functional changes in the brain that happen with the meditation practice. So I wanted to start with this study that I was talking about. And I was going to do a poll, but I'm not connected to the internet, and I need to be connected to the internet to do that. So I'm just going to skip that because I'll just tell you what was in the poll when I talk about this study. So the idea of this study, humans, as I was saying earlier, they have this remarkable ability to relive past experiences. We all do that. We can go back and relive a moment in time. We can relive an event, and we can even imagine a possible future. So we just have this capability of doing this. Our minds have the capability of doing this. And the question was that these researchers set out to answer was, does that ability come at an emotional cost? Okay. And so their methodology was something called experience sampling that we can do now that we all have smartphones in our pockets. They had an app that they had their participants download. And they recruited over 1,000 people to participate in this study. So they all downloaded this app, and at random intervals throughout the day, there was an alert, and they had to answer these questions. What are you doing right now? Rate your happiness on a scale from 0 to 100. Is your mind on what you're doing? And if not, are you thinking about something pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant? Okay, so those were the things I was going to ask you in the survey. But so you can maybe think about how would you answer that question? And so here are the results. This is a kind of interesting way of displaying data, but on the horizontal axis, what you see is the happiness rating, and then the size of the bubble is the frequency of occurrence. And so the first thing you'll notice is if you look at the bottom of the graph, you'll notice that not mind wandering is a bubble. And then pleasant, neutral, and unpleasant mind wandering, if you would put all three of those bubble areas together, it'd be about the same. So mind wandering, it turns out, occurred in about 47% of the samples. So almost half the time, participants reported that they were mind wandering and their mind was not on what they were doing. Another thing that came out of the data is that the activity had very little impact on whether mind wandering took place or the pleasantness of the topic to which the mind wandered. So even if you're thinking about something that is like sitting on the beach, didn't necessarily impact your happiness. Happiness ratings were lower during mind wandering than not. So that was a big revelation in this study, is that you weren't happier mind wandering at all, especially if your mind was on something neutral or negative. And you weren't, the subjects were not happier, didn't report happiness, even if they were mind wandering to pleasant topics. So that was also kind of surprising. So you can see that the happiness ratings kind of varied. Unfortunately, the activities that people spent the most time doing, so working, for example, the happiness ratings were kind of on the dotted line in the center of the plot is the mean happiness ratings. So the happiness ratings were below the mean for the activities that people spend the most time on. And some of the activities that people rated most high, you can see what some of those are, they spend the least time doing. So the teeny tiny bubble, making love, don't spend that much time doing it, but makes you really happy when you do. So the overall conclusion of the study was that people were no happier thinking about pleasant topics than just being present. So that was really surprising. And the conclusion, the title of this paper was a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. So if we spend half of our time being unhappy, being not present, then we're spending half of our time being unhappy. And so, of course, if there's a way to be more present, maybe we could add some happiness to our lives. Okay. So that's where mindfulness comes in. Mindfulness is almost exactly the definition of being present. In fact, the real definition that is given by Jon Kabat-Zinn is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Okay. So the non-judgment part is the hardest part, right? Sitting there and, oh, I'm thinking again, that judgment comes in. So learning, it's a practice that you learn how to do. You learn how to sit with your thoughts and not judge them. So a big challenge comes in. How do we scientifically study mindfulness? We kind of know what it is, but how do we operationally define it? How do we scientifically study it? So the studies that have been done, you can think of them is in falling into two broad categories. One is what we call cross-sectional studies, where you compare experienced meditators to non-meditators, so people who have never meditated before. And then we have longitudinal studies, which can be a little bit more powerful, where participants undergo a mindfulness training and you take pre and post training samples. So I'll talk about some of those, a couple of examples of those studies. What tool can we use? What tools can we use to assess mindfulness? One of the most popular ones is something called the Cognitive and Affective Mindfulness Scale. And so this is just a series of questions that participants answer. They're told, their instructions are, people have a variety of ways of relating to their thoughts and feelings. For each of the statements below, rate how much each of these applies to you, from 1 being rarely to 4 being almost always. And so their questions are something like, I'm preoccupied by the future, I'm easily distracted, I'm able to focus on the present moment. So some of them are directed in one direction, and some of them are directed in the other direction. And so you get a score on this scale, and that tells us how mindful are you. And so those kind of tools have been used then to assess, the question of does mindfulness help well-being? Can we enhance our well-being using mindfulness? And so I mentioned this mindfulness program that I got trained in and that I use in my class that is for emerging adults. So it's for this age group of 18 to 25-year-olds. And it was developed for that group because at Duke, in the counseling center, they were trying to incorporate mindfulness because they knew it, they thought it would be an effective tool to give these students, but the students didn't have the bandwidth or the time to dedicate to a more traditional mindfulness practice. So like mindfulness-based stress reduction, for example, requires a lot more intensive time of home practice and more in it's an 8-week program. This program that used to be called CORU, but is now called Mindfulness Institute for Emerging Adults, it's a 4-week program, and they ask the participants to do 10 minutes a day of practice on their own. So it's just a little bit lighter. It's a little more conducive to sticking with it if you're an 18, 19, 20-year-old person. So in this study, it was a randomized controlled trial of CORU. So we probably heard of randomized controlled trials a lot when we were going through the pandemic, but let me tell you what that means. Randomized means every participant is randomly assigned to a condition. So either, in this case, it was either the experimental group, which was the group that went through the mindfulness program, or the control group, which was a waitlist control. And controlled, of course, means there was a control group. Some studies, surprisingly, don't have a control group. We want to pay attention to studies that do have a control group. Okay, and emerging adults, as I mentioned, are 18 to 25-year-olds. So the study design involved a mindfulness intervention group, as I mentioned, and this waitlist control. So the waitlist control controls for changes over time, and controls for the motivation to participate in a program. So people on the wait list are motivated to participate in this program, but they just weren't chosen. And they actually eventually went through the program. So they got a chance to do it later. The participants were 90 graduate, undergraduate, and professional students at Duke University. The sample was mostly women, mostly white, and non-Hispanic. And then the procedure was they did an online survey with a battery of questionnaires administered before and after the 4-week course. So here's the intervention. It's a 4-week course that's met once per week for 75 minutes. It's free of charge, not graded, no course credit. As I mentioned, they're required to do, or they're asked to do 10 minutes a day of home practice, keep a log, and do some assigned readings. And then during class, the students learn a series of mindfulness practices, everything from breath techniques to guided imagery, to walking meditation, eating meditation. There's a whole bunch of different practices that they throw at them, that we throw at them. And so what do they measure? They measured a few things: perceived stress. So this is self-report. Medical outcomes, sleep study scale. So how well is sleep? The cognitive and affective mindfulness scale that I mentioned earlier, self-compassion scale, and then the gratitude questionnaire. And so they went into the study with a prediction that compared to baseline in the control group, the intervention group would show reduced stress, improved sleep, increased mindfulness, self-compassion, and gratitude. Okay, so what did they find? And so I know there's a lot on this slide, so I just want to direct your attention to the asterisks that are in the second column. That is telling us that there was a significant change from pre to post in the intervention group on all of these scales. And you'll notice that there's an asterisk by almost every single one of the measures, besides the gratitude one. Gratitude seemed to be high in the sample for even pre. And notice that the waitlist control, there was no change. There's no asterisks next to that post measure. So on almost all of the measures, there was a predicted improvement in perceived stress, sleep, mindfulness, self-compassion. And so their hypothesis was largely supported, and that suggests that the mindfulness program is effective in improving well-being in emerging adults. Okay, so this was in a sample of healthy volunteers. And so you might be asking, well, could this be helpful for people who are dealing with some kind of clinical mental health struggle? Something like major depression or generalized anxiety disorder. And so, the next study I'll talk about is it answers that question. So this study was a meta-analysis, and that is what a meta-analysis is it combines results of several studies statistically. And the studies are all addressing a similar question, so they can get a little bit more power by combining all the results. And so as a comparison, so just as a good benchmark to assess whether mindfulness interventions are effective, there was a meta-analysis that was done that found an effect size of 0.47, which is a medium effect size. Effect size just means what's the difference between your two groups, your control group and your intervention group. That is scaled by the deviation in the sample. So effect size is a statistical way of assessing how effective is your treatment. So a benchmark is 0.47 for various psychological, educational, behavior treatments. So that's a good benchmark to compare mindfulness interventions to know is it effective or not. So we should be seeing 0.47 or higher if mindfulness interventions are effective. And so this study, the objective was to evaluate the effectiveness of mindfulness-based therapy. So this is therapy therapy, so cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, but with mindfulness incorporated into the therapeutic approach. And in this study, they found a effect size for improving anxiety of 0.63. So that's higher than that 0.47 that I mentioned. And for mood symptoms, the effect size was 0.59 from pre to post treatment in the overall sample. So, mindfulness-based therapy overall was moderately effective in improving these mood disorders. In patients with anxiety and mood disorders, the intervention was associated with even really large effect sizes, 0.97, 0.95 for improving anxiety and mood symptoms respectively. It was 0.97 standard deviations. So if you the rule of thumb is that a large effect size would be over 0.8 and a medium effect size would be 0.5. And it takes the difference between the two means and divides it by the standard deviation. So it's a kind of a standardized way of assessing so it's separate from statistical significance because you can get a significant effect that's a small effect. So the effect size tells us how big is the effect. It's not only significant, but how big is it? How different are the two groups? Does that make sense?
So, yeah, because the numbers, I don't know statistics well enough to have it just.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The rule of thumb is 0.8 is a large effect size. So anything above 0.8 is really good. Anything above 0.5 is a medium effect size. And that's just the way they report these data. So, our overall conclusion from this study was that mindfulness-based therapy is a promising intervention in clinical populations. So not only does it help well-being in a volunteer sample, but also clinical populations. All right, so the next question might be then, how does the brain change? So how does the brain come in here? How does the neuroscience come in here? So, we can talk about two different kinds of studies. We could talk about a study that looks at changes in brain structure, and we could talk about studies that have looked at changes in brain function. And so I'll talk about structure first. This was a study that was done that examined brain structural differences between a group of meditators, experienced meditators, and controls, people who had no experience with meditation. And what they were looking at is cortical thickness. And so the outside of the outside of the brain has a cortex, 6 layers of cells. And the thicker that the cortex is, well, when you spend time doing something, like if you're a musician or if you are a juggler or whatever it is you have to do, the areas of the brain, specifically the cortex, will get larger as you practice that. And so if you're a musician, the area of the brain that is responsible for your fine finger movements is going to expand and get larger. And so we all are walking around with these specialized brains that have so much to do with what we do, what we spend the most time doing. Okay. And so cortical thickness is this measure that is done by going in an MRI and taking a picture of the brain, doing some imaging, and just literally measuring the thickness of the cortex. And so the idea here was that not necessarily that meditators have bigger brains or more cortex or thicker cortex, but there would be specific regions of the brain that are that would be larger in meditators than in the controls. And these regions would be the regions that are required for meditation, that we engage in meditation. And so the participants were 20 meditators from a local community, and then 15 control participants with no meditation experience. And the dependent variables were the cortical thickness in a particular region of interest. So they had some predetermined hypotheses about which regions would be most affected by the meditation practice. And then they also looked at age and meditation experience as well. So as they predicted, there were predicted areas of the brain that are that you would expect to be engaged when somebody is meditating. So think back to when I had you do the meditation practice. You were paying attention to your body, to the breath, the feeling of the breath coming in, the feeling of you sitting in the chair, the feeling of your mask, things like that. So you were relying on your sense of touch. You might have been more tuned into the sounds in the room. You might have been tuned into some of your thoughts and emotions that were going on. And so the areas of the brain that are that showed a significant difference in meditators and controls were areas that you would expect. So the right frontal area, so the frontal cortex, that is involved in integrating all of those different sensory experiences and telling us what's going on in our body. So that's BA stands for Brodmann's area. That's just a characterization of anatomical regions of the cortex. So the right frontal cortex was larger in meditators versus controls. And then there was an age by group interaction with controls, but not meditators, showing reduced thickness with age in these areas. So the controls, were losing brain volume over time with age. And then this was not happening in the meditation group. And so what could be happening at the level of the cells? It's not that we're adding new neurons. We don't get new neurons, unfortunately, in our life, except in one particular brain region, but by and large, we don't get new neurons. So what is happening to increase the volume of the cortex? The dendrites, that are the recipients of information from other nerve cells, are actually expanding and becoming more complex. And that's happening when we sit in this room and you hear these talks. It's changing your brain. So the brain is very dynamic. And like I said, your brain is going to reflect what you spend the most time doing. And so if you spend a lot of time meditating, your brain is going to reflect that. So let's look at some pictures just to bring this point home. And so what you're seeing on the left is a brain that has been artificially kind of using computer ballooned out so you can see all of the surface of the brain. So normally, if you can picture, if you've seen a brain, it's very wrinkly, right? There's all kinds of convolution, especially a human brain. There's a lot of sulci and gyri, which are the grooves in the brain. And so what they've done with this brain is kind of inflate it so you can see all the surfaces. And what they've done is they're showing in a heat map with the colors in red being the highest activation. In this case, what the red means is that the regions where the brain the brain region was thicker in meditators versus controls. So it wasn't everywhere, right? You can only see these little dots here and there where there's red or yellow lighting up in the brain. And there were 4 basic regions of interest. One is called the insula, that's an area that is involved in our feeling, being able to have a sense of our body, and to look inward and to feel, to kind of integrate all of our senses. And that communicates well with this frontal area that I mentioned, Brodmann's area 9 and 10. That's up here in the front of the brain. And then we have somatosensory cortex, which is the area of the brain that is responsive to touch, that processes touch information. And then auditory cortex processes auditory or hearing. So there were these 4 regions that were especially where the cortex was especially thicker in meditators versus controls. And in 2 of those regions, they've done a scatter plot of thickness, cortical thickness, and age. And you can see that that there is, especially for D, which is the Brodmann's area, there is a correlation or a relationship between thickness and age, where the cortical thickness gets this is in the controls, where the cortical thickness goes down as age goes up. So cortical thickness is getting lower as age goes up. So that's a negative slope there. In the meditators, that was not the case, right? So the blue dots are the meditators, the red dots are the controls. And so meditation, we have to be careful about our conclusions because we don't know if this is a causal relationship, but it's definitely associated. Meditation is associated with this preservation of cortical thickness across aging. So that was pretty exciting, a finding. So the conclusions then from that study, and I'm just giving you kind of a sample of studies. There are a lot of studies that have been done, but I can't talk about all of them. So the conclusions were that meditation practice is associated with greater cortical thickness in brain regions, specifically related to sensory and what we call interoceptive processing, which is the integration of body signals, body touch, hearing, and so forth. And this is an example of what we call experience-dependent plasticity. And the more time we spend engaging in a particular activity, the more what I call cortical real estate there will be dedicated to that activity. So so we talked about structural changes, but what about changes in function? How do we know that those structural changes have anything to do with how the brain is functioning? Yeah, go ahead.
So in the image in the graph, it looks like there's a dip around 30 and 35.
Yeah, for some reason, they just didn't have participants in that age group. I think they're probably I think they're maybe like raising their kids, so they're not volunteering for studies. Are there other questions now that I'm, yeah. Okay. So I'll just talk real quick about functional changes then. So this study that I'll talk about next mentions a network in the brain called the default mode network. And this is a collection of structures, a group of brain regions that show lower levels of activity when we're engaged in a task, such as paying attention. So it was discovered by accident. The participants in a study were told, don't do anything, just lay in the scanner and we'll be back. And they noticed that when they when they said, okay, we're back, let's do the task, there were certain regions of the brain that actually decreased their activity when they were doing that, when they were asked to do a task. And so what does that mean? That means that there was this region of this network of brain regions that was activated when the participants were doing nothing, right? But we know that if I asked you to just sit here and do nothing, what are you going to do? You're going to think, your mind's going to wander, as long as you don't have your phone, to scroll on. But you're going to be doing things like daydreaming, recalling memories, thinking about the future, like what am I going to have for dinner when I get home, thinking about your to-do list, monitoring the environment, and so on. And so by accident, they discovered this network that they called the default mode network. And it consists of brain structures, including the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the inferior parietal lobule. And so these regions are co-active when someone is engaged in mind wandering. And so what do you think happens during meditation? Let's see. So what the way they did this experiment, they had experienced meditators and non-meditators. They were asked to do 3 different meditation practices in the scanner. And then they compared the activation patterns in these groups of structures between baseline periods and periods of meditation for both groups. And what they found is that experienced meditators demonstrate decreased activity in the default mode network during meditation. And so if we look at these graphs, you can see the brain maps show areas where the meditators were different than controls. And so notice that you may remember, these are the same regions that are part of the default mode network, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex. And so, and if we look at these bar graphs, the colored bars indicate the different mindfulness practices. They were asked to do 3 different practices. So it didn't really matter what kind of practice they were doing. The meditators showed a decreased activity. And so what's on the vertical axis here is something called the bold signal change, and that is the blood oxygen level. It is a proxy for neural activity that is used in functional MRI experiments. And so values below 0 mean there was a decrease in activity from baseline. So the meditators, when they were meditating, they showed a decreased activity in the default mode network. And so, and when they were asked what was happening during that time, they reported less mind wandering during meditation, and compared to the baseline periods. So they were meditating. They actually reported that they weren't mind wandering as much. So when we see reduced default mode network activity, we see the reduction in mind wandering. Okay. So the takeaways, and then I'll take some questions. Mind wandering is very common, even though we're happier being just present. Mindfulness training can be really effective in enhancing well-being. Mindfulness-based therapy is also effective and doesn't have any side effects. And mindfulness training is associated with functional and structural changes in the brain. So I'm happy to take some questions if we have time.
When somebody asks you a question, could you
Repeat,
it?
of course.
So that, yeah.
Yep.
I was curious, that last slide, the green mindfulness exercise, it seemed like the control group also experienced a decrease. I was curious if you knew what they were doing, that both the meditators and the control group experienced that change.
I think that was a loving kindness. So, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly which was which. I would have to go back and look at the paper, but I can do that after the talk and let you know. Uh-huh.
Thanks. I have a comment and a question. The comment is default mode dissipates, but executive functioning is actually occurring during meditation. Can you just speak about that for a moment?
Yeah, so the question was when the default mode network is damping down, but the executive network is ramping up during meditation, and that's true. So what is the executive network? The executive network is kind of, as the name implies, is this network that is directing your thoughts. So it's saying, hey, we're supposed to be meditating right now. Let's get back to what we're supposed to be doing. That would be the executive. And so the executive network, which is another collection of brain structures that is responsible for that, it will be more activated during meditation, particularly during times when you've noticed that your mind has wandered. And so there's another study that I didn't talk about tonight, but that asked participants to indicate when their mind's wandering and when they got back to the breath. And so they were pushing buttons basically to indicate what was happening in their mind at different times. And the let's get back to it, let's get back to the breath was associated with the executive network coming on and saying, hey, let's go.
So executive and default or vacillating.
Yeah, they're kind of teeter-tottering, you know, so when one is high, the other one is low.
And one other, I think, there's more to default mode than mind wandering.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like, for example, being in very, very deep states, those who practice can be able to do that, where they can slow down their heart for like less than 15 beats and things like that. They seem to be in a very much deep default mode. So there's levels of a default mode, and one of them is mind wandering.
Yeah, so so there can be different practices, like he's talking about some practices where that take years and years and years to develop. And so yeah, the default mode would be it's really been studied in just lay people, not like the advanced practitioners. It's a good question of what the default mode network would be doing in those monastics, those people that are kind of expert meditators, and that's what they do all day, every day. And I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know if anybody has done that study. The EEG studies, yeah, that have been done. Yeah, those were the first studies that were done, and actually they had to convince these monastics to come and do EEG studies in the lab, and the monastics, the monks said, well, why? You know, what? They were a little bit afraid that they weren't going to find anything, that they weren't going to find anything different about their brain activity than some other person, not non-monastic, but they did find differences in the level of oscillatory synchrony in the brains of meditators was much higher. So
Oscillating synchrony.
yeah, so brain rhythms were so the brain was in a much more synchronized, and that's all EEG can really measure. They don't really know what that means, but you don't know what it means that the brain is synchronized, but it's just that the rhythms that you can record from the scalp were much stronger than in compared to the control condition. I don't have any images of that tonight, no.
That's EEG stuff.
That's EEG. Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
Is there a difference between DMN and the NM on your slide?
No, that was just a typo. Thanks for that question.
Question about mind wandering. I don't think it's, I'm not sure what the definition is of mind wandering. But I don't think mind wandering is bad, especially in meditation. There's mind wandering and then there's mind wandering into something.
Mhm.
And it's, you're taking associations and collecting things from various states and various parts of your brain and various understandings of life, I think.
Yeah.
That is it's intense mind wandering, and I don't think it's that bad at all.
That you sound exactly like my students. They're always saying, well, I think all day and thinking is good. I'm supposed to think. I'm a student. I'm supposed to think.
No, I'm talking about something else. I'm
Yeah.
talking about a mind wandering where you're opening up, your mind is much more expansive.
Yeah.
I'm not just talking about, that I'm doing schoolwork. I'm talking about like another state where you are taking things, it's hard to explain, but you're
Mhm.
taking things from different areas.
Where you're gaining insight.
You're gaining, yeah.
Yeah.
And on many levels,
Mhm.
that's the form of mind wandering, and I think that's good. I think that's good if you're creating, if you're a creator.
Yeah.
And I think it's also good in meditation.
I agree. I think that sometimes the negative mind wandering that can happen with like rumination and stressing can get in the way of that creative process that you're talking about. So if you can, sometimes you can use meditation, just the breath awareness meditation, to calm yourself, get your nervous system to a calmer state. And then you can kind of go into that insight. So a lot of times shamatha, or the breath awareness practice, is practiced first, and then you might venture into the insights. So a little bit of introspection and thinking about making connections about things that you're talking about. So yeah, that was a good point. Over here.
So dreams and nightmares, is that like the ultimate mind wandering, or is that just random stuff that has nothing to do with all this?
You're not going to like my answer. The question is dreams and nightmares. Does that have anything to do with mind wandering, or is it just random? My thought is that it's just random. It's just random activity that your brain is generating. It's not just my opinion, but this is what most neuroscientists think, is that your brain is generating some random, almost like recapitulating things that happened in your day. And the parts of your brain that are good at making stories, just put a storyline on top of that. So mind wandering is different because you're doing it when you're awake, and you are actually mentally time traveling. You're kind of going back in time, or you're going ahead in time. The dreaming, no, not necessarily. If you don't go into if you don't get the good slow wave sleep and the REM sleep, then it can make your memory pretty bad. Yeah, it can interfere with the memory.
I'm wondering if there are studies about like the different neurobiological things that happen depending on the kind of mindfulness somebody practices.
Mhm.
So like guided imagery versus breath work versus like tuning into the five senses, kind of grounding sort of stuff. Do those have differences in neurobiology at all?
Yes. The question is, do different meditation or mindfulness practices have different neurobiological substrates or underpinnings? And yes. So most of the research has been done on the type of meditation that's easier to study, because you can just put somebody in a scanner and tell them do the breath awareness. And the second most common practice is a compassion or a loving kindness practice. And those in those kinds of studies, the brain areas that you would expect that are involved more in the emotional processing, as well as some of the stress reduction, like areas that you would expect to be kind of damped down when stress levels decrease, would be. So it's really, you know, whatever style of meditation you're practicing, the brain regions that are most important for that will be engaged. Yeah, but compassion and loving kindness are a totally different animal than the breath awareness, because instead of just being present with your breath or your body, you are actually thinking of a person, and you're thinking of a specific person, and you're sending loving kindness thoughts or compassionate thoughts to them. So it really is imaginative. And so you need some of your default mode network actually to be activated for that. So you need the areas of your brain that are recalling that person, bringing that person to mind, and thinking about and generating those feelings of compassion or loving kindness toward them. So thanks for that question. I don't know who.
So, I'm Quaker, and Quaker's religion that goes back to the 1660s. And even though some of the vocabulary is different,
Yeah.
a lot of what happens once a week is an hour of meditation.
Yes. Yes.
But one big difference is that what's really important is being in a group and having
Yeah.
that group. The group silence is very different from being alone, and that it's often, as a group, we feel like it's much richer because you're doing it together.
Mhm.
And it's so, but I was wondering, that's not a group that Quakers, they're not as intense as monks. They're not doing meditation in the definition that has been, you know, like done in a lot of ashrams, I guess. But I was wondering whether they, as a group, have been looked at. Anybody studied like studies of Quakers, because that's the kind of thing that's done on a weekly basis for years.
Yeah. Not that I know of. Maybe I should do it. My daughter goes to Wilmington Friends, so I'm familiar with the Quaker.
And meeting is we oversee Friends School. So, but yeah, I mean, I just think people have been talking about mindfulness, and I'm thinking, gosh, Quakers have been doing it for 300 years, and the vocabulary is different, but it seems like it's much the same. So,
yeah, and that's, you know, these mindfulness practices have been practiced for, you know, at least 2,500 years, because that's when they were first written down, was 2,500 years ago. And we keep calling it something different and thinking that it's something different, but it's actually the same thing. It's just being present. It's just being in the moment, either paying attention to the body, the breath. Being in community is another big aspect. Even in you know, Tibetan Buddhism, there's something called the Sangha, which is the group. You have the Buddha, you have the Sangha. You have your so there is there's definitely a collective feeling with a meditation practice, even though it's thought of as a very solitary activity. That the support that you get from your community is really important, as you said.
I mean, because this starts to go into so many directions, whether consciousness is, you know, inside the brain or outside, or, you know, being as.
Well, you know what I think.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about, you know, inspiration and human groups, and it starts to go into a completely different level.
Yeah.
Please repeat what the question
Uh,
was.
It was more of a comment about consciousness being inside or outside the brain. We could have a whole nother talk on that one tonight. What did you want to say?
this is directed toward emerging adults. Having a lot of grandchildren.
Yeah.
A lot of them have been or are medicated. And I mean, that comes with, you know, a lot of dangers of ever eventually, but I just didn't know if there's a way that mindfulness.
The trouble with my vision, adult migraine.
Okay.
And, I learned a piece for, I never had to call. I was in Nepal. I was familiar with the Tibetan, I read the Tibetan book. And learned more about Hinduism, Buddhism.
Mhm.
Not that I am interested in practice, but, when I came back to the United States, I went back to Japan. I developed a problem with the amount of studying I was doing, the work I was thinking about, that it interfered with my vision. And when I talked to doctors, they found I was in a problem with my eyes. I think the problem was in my brain, and I still experience that now and then. But one of the things that I learned at 10 was I took a very simple course in meditation.
Yeah.
At the being altered by like something called transcendental.
Yeah. TM. Yeah.
And I learned to focus on I did it then regularly. I don't do it often any longer, but I can do it again if I want. It isn't as deep and as expression as it was then. And I probably get into that again, but it's an interesting experience because one of the things that I noticed causes this vision problem to get so bad that it doesn't cause my brain. Because it breaks up my vision. And it's a, something to do with, I'm trying to do too many things at once with my brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I'm doing too many things, trying to resolve problems, time,
Yeah.
breaks up.
Okay. So so if you didn't hear, let me try to summarize. Oh my gosh. Okay. So, this fellow noticed that, since for a long time that, that every once in a while, when he tried to think about something, like studying in school, the vision would cut out, right? And this is very interesting. And so, and then started studying transcendental meditation, and noticed that was helpful in cutting down the vision impairment that comes with. For me, it's like I'm immediately going to, maybe it's like sensory processing issues, like there's too much, the brain can only handle so much at once. And so maybe with the TM, the transcendental meditation, that was, allowing you to focus, and cutting down on all of the different things going on. And you could allocate your brain resources to one, to your vision. That's the first time I've heard, of anything like that happening. So that's really interesting. Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
And when I learned that, I literally spent less than an hour. I walked away
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
with incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Okay.
What's the difference in transcendental meditation
Mm.
versus mindfulness or meditation?
Transcendental meditation requires, you can correct me if I'm wrong. It requires a teacher. It's very directed teacher-student There's a teacher-student relationship. Usually transcendental, is it right? It's chanting, a mantra. Yeah, they give you a mantra. So the difference between the difference in you guys all experience what we did tonight. The instruction is bring the attention to the breath. And so in transcendental meditation, the object of meditation, what you're bringing your attention to is the mantra. And the mantra is given by your teacher. So it's kind of a individualized practice. And whereas,
I thought it was kind of magic. But
Yeah.
Then I read an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer that told me it was a sign that certain age bracket. There was a different medicine mantra.
yeah.
Oh, I didn't keep that.
Mhm.
Oh, I'm afraid about it. Here. Mind drift off, doing something else. Come back.
Yeah. So it's the same.
One minute. Walk away from it. Feel like-
So the instruction was just come back to the mantra. When your mind wanders, you come back to the mantra, and it was really effective for you.
Apparently, if you pay attention to it, really
Yeah, yeah. So it gives you something to focus on. There's nothing particularly special about the breath. It just gives you something to focus on. So if people have problems with breathing, you don't want to bring the attention to the breath, you can bring the breath, you can bring the attention to something else.
I think that's a really fascinating thing of what you said about, and I'll try to speak loudly so that you don't have to repeat this. Because it's reminding me of the field of optogenetics, which you probably know about.
Yeah.
And what I'm worried about is our cell phones, right? So I'm a real luddite. I just got a smartphone in February of this year, and I can't wait to get rid of it. It's already gone in the river, I don't know how many times. It has fractured my thinking in a way that I cannot stand. I'm a visual artist and I will not have it in my life. And I'm looking and I'm reading about optogenetics and it's this. We have to start thinking of this. What is this doing to our minds? You're already giving us a clue. I think you were really
And I
sensitive.
read one book about
Yeah.
sleep, and
Uh-huh.
I'm now reading another book about memory,
Okay.
that was put together by an Indian, who came over when he was in, but he had David, and he wrote a book about why we, how we remember. And he talks about the brain, I know much more about the theory of the brain and what's going on in the brain. I don't know.
Well, the visuals, I think, are really important, what's going on. I think this is a field that needs to really be looked at. I mean, what did you say? It's the exact opposite of what you had us do, right? It's the exact.
Oh, the smartphones?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I'm doing Qigong now, like I've never, and all I have to do is get those eyes and I'm zooming out, man. And that's it. And this is all the exact opposite.
Mhm.
So it's like we're trying to do all this stuff, but we keep having these tools. that-
We're up against some big obstacles. Yeah.